You and me, oh boy, do we have history. Only this time, you're going down. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale M1 Abrams main battle tank. Now, this model here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these smaller scale build videos, I often take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. However, with this model here being 1/72nd scale, this is not a scale that I actively work in, nor is it a scale that I offer commission build services for. However, if anyone watching this is interested in the scales that I do offer services in, I can be reached via the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. There we can discuss pricing info as well as the type of builds that I can offer you. Now, the model that we have here is built predominantly out of the box. In this video, I'm going to review the base starter kit, as well as go over some of the kit's aspects, as well as even some of the areas to watch out for if anyone is interested in putting one of these older kits together. So stay tuned because there's a lot of info that's going to be coming at you. Before we continue with the video, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. Now, if you ask any Tom, Dick, or Harry on what this vehicle is, of course they're going to respond the M1 Abrams. However, unlike the type of M1s which are generally seen in popular culture and video games and also on the news quite frequently, this version here is more unique, as this one here is the original adopted version of the M1 Abrams main battle tank. What we have here is the M1 at the beginning of its service life. This vehicle, of course, dates back to the late 1960s and the early to mid-1970s. Of course, at this time, the M1 was not even on the drawing board because at this time, the U.S. military was designing a next-generation tank to replace the M60 series. In cooperation with the West German government, the two countries developed the MBT-70. Now, of course, as we all know, the MBT-70 was a very ambitious tank project, however, was becoming a massive money pit, and because of which both countries decided to drop the program. Now, although the MBT-70 was a dead end and was a failure, both of the developing countries took many of the design lessons and fabrication techniques which were experimented on the MBT-70 and incorporated them into the next generation of tank designs. The West Germans, of course, would take the lessons they learned and incorporate them into the Leopard 2, while the U.S. military would take the lessons they learned and develop them into their new vehicle, which would eventually become the M1 Abrams. Outside of the design cues, which were again imported from the MBT-70 program, during the 1970s was actually a very interesting time for armor development. During this decade, there were a lot of new lessons being learned from the Middle East conflicts, as well as also a lot of new technologies which were being developed in the West. Both of these lessons and technologies were going to be incorporated in the new M1 Abrams tank design. Some of the lessons which were being learned by the U.S. military are actually seen via proxy from the Israeli conflicts. The Israelis at this time just finished up the Yom Kippur War, where they utilized both the M60, the M48, as well as the Centurions. All three of these vehicles encountered the new, at the time, current state-of-the-art Russian anti-tank weapons like the RPG-7, as well as the Sager. After seeing how all three of these vehicles performed, one of the key attributes of the new M1's design was to focus on crew survivability, as well as a way to try to defeat the shaped charges found on these anti-tank weapons. Another design consideration learned from the Israelis had to do with the overall silhouette of the vehicle. With the legacy vehicles, namely the Patton and the M60, they did have a high silhouette. However, for the new M1 program, they wanted to have a tank which was going to be lower than the legacy vehicles. Now, one breakthrough that emerged during this period was with the way to defeat the shaped charge. In the United Kingdom, there was a town called Chobham, and there was a developmental team which developed a new way to to make tank armor. This tank armor utilized several different layers of materials which, when sandwiched together, had a way of disrupting the shaped charge, thus defeating it and preventing it from penetrating into the vehicle. This type of armor showed huge potential, and the M1 Abrams is going to be the first production vehicle to utilize this armor, so realistically it was actually a bit of a guinea pig. Also at this time, there was a huge technological advancement in electronics. This led its way to military technology, and for the M1 led to a really good gun stabilization unit, fire control system, as well as even night vision capabilities. For the vehicle's main gun, one of the lessons learned from the M60A2 Starship and the MBT-70 program was that the Shalehi missile, although very advanced, was just not going to be practical for realistic environments and realistic engagements. Because of that, the M1 program was going to default back to a standard rifled main gun. With those parameters set, two companies came up to the plate with prototypes. One was from General Motors and the second was from Chrysler. At the end of the testing, the Chrysler design was designated to be the Victor, and this was the design which would enter into production and to be developed to what we know today as the M1 Abrams. The M1 was a complete departure in any way possible compared to the legacy vehicles. Unlike the earlier designs, which utilized large all-cast components for sections of the hull and the turret, the M1 was primarily made with rolled flat plates. This undoubtedly has to do with the composition of the Chobham armor, where trying to get this type of armor protection with the all-cast type materials is just not feasible or even possible. Aside from the Chobham armor, another crucial survivability improvement that the M1 had was that the ammunition was stowed separately from the crew compartment. The ammunition was stowed in the rear of the turret, which was isolated via blast doors in the rear section. There were blowout panels found on the top of the turret, so if the vehicle was to get penetrated and the magazines would go up, they would vent harmlessly out into the environment rather than destroying the entire tank, which was typically a problem found on the legacy vehicles of all types. With all this armor protection, the vehicle weighed in at close to 60 tons. In order to propel this vehicle, rather than going with the conventional turbo diesel route, the M1 Abrams was the first American vehicle to be equipped with a gas turbine jet engine. With this power plant, the M1 was able to reach speeds that were blistering compared to the other legacy vehicles. The vehicle would have clocked in at probably around 70 to almost 75 miles an hour. So much so that the tank had to be slowed down in later iterations via a governor system because the extra speed would put unneeded wear and tear on the tracks and the running gear. For the armament, the original M1 utilized the off-the-shelf 105mm L7 rifled main gun. This is the gun which was utilized on the M60A1 and was also standardized throughout the rest of NATO. Now this of course was going to be a stopgap measure, as eventually this gun would be replaced by the 120, but really that's a topic for another day and another video. Now for the vehicle secondary armament, the military learned their lesson from the debacle which was the M73 and the M85. For the commander, he had a single Browning M2HB 50 caliber machine gun, which was mounted on a remote control firing pedestal on his low profile cupola. The mini turret concept, which was a late 50s, 1960s adaptation, was no longer going to be used on American tanks thus forth. For the loader, he had a single, newly adopted at the time, FN M240 machine gun. The M240 was also utilized for the coaxial machine gun found inside of the vehicle. The M1 Abrams was adopted for official U.S. military service in 1980 and has remained the main battle tank for the U.S. military ever since. What's also interesting to point out that a large number of these early vehicles were produced, and many of them are actually still in service today, albeit in a upgraded skies. The U.S. military has a rebuild program where after a number of years the hulls get completely sandblasted, stripped down, and the vehicles are rebuilt from the hull up to new current specs. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this vintage 1/72nd scale M1 Abrams tank kit from ESCI. Now, for anyone who's a frequent viewer of the channel, you'll notice that this is not the first ESCI kit to come across this desk here. I've recently completed a couple of the ESCI 1/72nd scale model kits, and like I said in those videos, the ESCI kits are vintage kits and date back to the late 70s and the early 1980s. This kit, however, is a little bit different. The M1 Abrams from ESCI dates to 1986. Around this time, this was actually very noteworthy because the M1 Abrams was brand new at this time and was starting to be fielded by the US military. ESCI not only did this vehicle in 1/72nd scale, but also tooled up a 1/35th scale counterpart. In addition to ESCI, this was also done by Tamiya, who tooled up their 1/35th scale motorized kit as well. Of course, in the recent years that followed, M1 Abrams kits have been released by a number of manufacturers in several different scales, but it is noteworthy to point out that ESCI was one of the first to actually pull it off. Now, like I said in my other videos, ESCI was an Italian-based plastic model kit company that was very prolific during this time period. The M1 Abrams kit was released in this original skies, and this was the original box art of this kit release. Like I said, this kit dates to the mid-1980s. In the years that followed this release, ESCI not only retooled this kit when the M1A1 started becoming fielded, but they also changed the box art and even took on different distributors for the US distribution. Namely, Ertl was the company that took the ESCI tooling and distributed in the continental US, which was again mentioned in my last M48A5 build video. Now, also, like I mentioned in the pre-video bumper, I do have a personal connection to this kit here because, well, frankly, this was one of the first plastic model kits that I built and was one of the first that was a big disappointment for me personally. The year was 1993 or so, and I was in my local hobby shop as a wee little youngster. I saw in the stash they had an M1 kit. At the time, the M1 was really big news. This was shortly after the Gulf War, and these model kits and toys of these things were everywhere, and I was getting into plastic model building, and I wanted to get an M1 kit. The version found in the hobby shop was the rendition from Ertl, and was about $5 or $10 or so. With my grandmother's birthday money in hand, I went ahead and purchased a kit, brought it home, opened it up, ready to dig into it, and I instantly ran into a roadblock. And you'll see that once I crack open the box, and if anyone's a fan of my videos, you'll probably kind of guess why I ran into a problem with this kit. But before I do, let me go ahead and review the box art, and then crack the kit open, and you'll see exactly what the problem was that I had as a youngster. Starting with the box art, here we have an M1 Abrams tank. Note this is not an M1A1 or any A designation of any sort. This is the original M1 Abrams with the 105mm gun. And here we have the vehicle driving down a dirt path, kicking up a pile of dust, which is what an M1 would do because of that nice turbine engine it's got in the rear. The rendition is pretty decent. Yeah, it's average for, box art goes. I've seen better, but I've also seen a lot worse, and it basically gets the job done. Here we have the ESCI logo, the type of fonts typically found on these ESCI kits. The rest of the graphic design is as follows. Here we have the red type box with the corporate info on it, as well as also a brief background of the vehicle in question. On the back of the box, it just features the same box art that was showcased on the front. Now, this kit here was a recent addition to the stash. I went ahead and purchased it off of eBay, and it hasn't been sitting in the stash for a long period of time. The model was acquired for about $5 or $10 US, and which is basically the going rate for these kits. Now, unlike the M60A1 that was recently completed, as well as also some of the M48 variants, in which those kits are released by Italy as they have the rights to those kits. I'm not sure if the Abrams ever was re-released or has seen the light of day ever since. So this kit here may be a little bit more trickier to find compared to the M60 counterparts, but this one here is relatively easy to find, again, on places like eBay, and you'll probably also be able to snag one in a model show. Cracking open the box, you'll see the kit contents. Just like with many of the other ESCI kits, it is a side opening box, which again, it's weird to point out because that's not really commonly done these days. And here go the kit contents. The kit is molded in this gray or Panzer Gray type coloring, and I've seen different colors used with the different re-releases of this kit, namely the Earl one I had, I believe, was a tan coloring. However, the kit's tooling is identical and is exactly the same. Just like with the other ESCI kits, they come sealed in this bag, of course made in Italy. And let's go ahead and crack this guy open so I get to show the kit contents. First runner is the hull. You notice on this model here, the hull is actually comprised of a mosaic type pattern, where we have the bottom plate, the upper hull, and two hull sides. On the reverse side, you'll notice the molded-in torsion bar details. Just like with the M60 and the M48 kits that I recently completed, the molded-in detailing on these older ESCI kits are actually pretty good. Even though the kits are pushing 30 some odd years old, the tooling held up pretty well in my opinion. Note the engine grills are nice and finely molded. Keep in mind, these kits were developed years before CNC mold tooling, likes of which that we have today, and I believe these old kits were handcrafted, which is definitely an old art that is not really seen anymore. Here we have the engine grill now in focus. The taillights do have their lenses present, which is pretty nicely detailed for, again, a tank of this scale. Here go the Pioneer rack and the tow cables. Of course, this is the main gun, being the 105. Moving from this runner brings us to the next runner, and this is where I ran into my problems as a youngster. Just like with the other ESCI kits of this period, this kit here features the individual link and length track. And building this model for the first time, it was a complete and utter disaster. Now, I was able to build the model, just the tracks were not really the best. With the M1, it's not really that much of a problem because the side skirts do cover up the majority of the upper row wheel section, so I was able to cobble enough track together to complete the bottom sections. But yeah, this was one of the kits that put me on my path of utter disdainment for individual link and length. So if you ever want to know why I hate those tracks, here you go. Anyway, in recent years I've had some pretty decent luck with individual link and length tracks, specifically in 1/72nd scale and on ESCI kits, so I believe I should be able to tackle it this time around. The tracks are the earlier rendition, or I should say the earlier pattern of Abrams track, in which there's a chevron found on the rubber pads. Of course, as the M1 would develop further from this point in the 1990s and 2000s, the track design was changed to the Bigfoot pattern track, which is chevronless. With this tank being a standard M1, these tracks are perfectly acceptable for this vehicle. The last runner is the turret. Now, quick note, you'll notice that this turret is an M1 pattern as opposed to an M1A1 or an M1A2. I'm not going to go into the details at this point in the video, that's going to be saved for later on, but the big difference, of course, are the blow-up panels. The profile is much different compared to the later renditions of the Abrams. You can see the molding and detailing of the weld lines that are present, as well as the other details like the smoke grenade launching conduits. Bottom portion of the tire is pretty plain, not really a whole lot going on down there. And here go the remainder of the details. There goes your M240, M2HB on the original M1 Abrams piddle mount, smoke grenade launchers, mantlet, hatches, bin components, and also the running gear. Moving along takes us to the tank sprockets. Note that because this is an early rendition of the M1, the sprockets do have their cool little cage guard found on them, which of course was dropped on later production units. I'll go over that more as the build progresses. And on the inside, you can see that in addition to the outer guard, we also have sprocket teeth rendered on the inside, which is a nice touch. From there, now brings us to the row wheels. You'll notice that the row wheels, just like with the M48A5 and the M60s that I recently completed from ESCI, they are solid through and through and do not have their two assembly design. Now, this would be generally considered a ding on these older ESCI kits, but again, for the age of the tooling, I could live with this type of assembly. Moving downward brings us to the side skirts. And what's interesting is that they went ahead and did the M1 with the cutout of the rear fender panel. On many of these early M1s, this section here would connect with an angle type appearance, but they went with the carved out version that we have here. Detailing is pretty good. Again, typical for what you would expect on these older ESCI kits. From the runner now brings us to the instructions, and typical ESCI 1980s goodness in terms of the assembly, which I will probably be doing this in a very different way, as I've tried doing this type of method when I was younger and it was a bloody disaster. So this should be interesting to see how I cope and tackle with it now that I'm a lot bigger. Finally, from the instructions takes us to the markings. One decal sheet is supplied. The decal sheet is this really piss yellow type coloring, but this appears just to be the paper itself. The markings, looking in the light, look to be pretty good, so I'm not expecting there to be too many problems with these markings here. Of course, if anything goes awry, I'll definitely be mentioning it towards the end of the video. Starting with the model suspension, like I mentioned earlier, that this kit does feature the link and length method of track assembly. And this, of course, is true for all the other ESCI kits as well. Now, we can recall from the M48A5 as well as the M60A1 builds that I've recently completed, the way I do the link and length on these ESCI kits is no different on this M1. This is where I take the row wheels, I temporarily affix them to the torsion bars without any glue, and from there I go ahead and permanently glue the track to the wheels. Once the glues are fully set and dry, the entire track with the row wheels, the idler, and the sprocket can be removed off of the model's hull in one complete pontoon. Why this is an advantage has to do with the overall build and paint of the rest of the vehicle. Now, if you try to assemble this model with the track already pre-assembled to the side and basically try to paint the model in its fully completed and final assembled form, which, by the way, I've seen some people actually recommend, which in my opinion is completely bonkers, because, well, in my personal experience, you're going to have a really hard time in getting all of the fine detailing both on the track, the running gear, as well as on the inside portions of the hull painted in a thorough and arguably proper manner. By having all of these components painted separately, this allows you to thoroughly paint all the fine detailing found on the running gear as well as the track, but also the model itself. On this model here, the tracks and the side skirts are actually mounted at the very end of the model's construction. This does include after all of the paint, camouflage, and weathering work is completed. At that point in the model, the tracks simply get slipped back onto their appropriate locations. Then the side skirts gets mounted, and the tank at that point is basically finished. Now, while on the row wheels, I do want to point out that the tooling for the row wheels where they meet the swing arms that are molded into the side of the hull are very, very snug. So snug that you may have difficulty with trying to press these pieces on, to which case, stop, because what you're going to do is you're just going to snap off one of the swing arms and it's going to cause more problems. What I recommend doing, and this is what was done to this build here, was that on every one of these wheels, with a pin vise and a small micro Dremel bit that was slightly larger than the hole that was found on the tooling, I went ahead and enlarged the hole. By doing this, this freed up the tolerances to allow the wheels to slide onto their appropriate locations. Now, this is specifically true with the pieces being pre-assembled and then mounted at the tail end, like I said before. The reason is because if you go with that route, you are going to have some layers of paint that are built up, be it thin layers, but layers nonetheless, which can inhibit the wheels from sliding on even further. So a pin vise with a Dremel bit is going to be recommended for this assembly that we have here. Now, when it comes to the track itself, as we all know, I am far of being a fan of this type of track assembly method, but I was able to get it assembled on this model, and it went together in a fairly easy way. Now, I do want to point out that when you are assembling the track pontoons, they are very, very fragile and frail and are extremely susceptible to breakage, either at these small little points that we have here, because as you can see, the amount of plastic found on these track sections are very thin and, again, can snap. If they do, you got to be very cautious because it can lead to issues with some of the track tension. So, again, a lot of caution needs to be exhibited on that assembly. Once the tracks are installed, however, in this format, they're basically good to go. Now, on the weathering, the tracks are not rusty on this vehicle because this model here is basically representing an M1 Abrams that was recently entered into service. So by having the tracks being rusty could be considered anachronistic for this model. That doesn't mean, however, that the tracks are one solid color. It may be hard to come out with this lighting, but the tracks are actually two colors. We have the rubber color for the inner and outer pads, and the metal guide horns are a darker shade of dark gray, which again has been mentioned on several of my other tank videos in the past. By doing this, this also helps with some of the details on the model as it gives some different color contrast. Again, more visible than I'm seeing here on my viewfinder screen, but it is something to point out. One final note on the road wheels is that you'll see that the road wheel hubs are painted in gloss black. Now, on the M1 Abrams family, the hubcaps are actually made from clear plastic. This is done so that the crew can see their oil levels for the bearings that are found on the swing arms. With the model being molded in opaque plastic, this is obviously not going to be possible to mimic. So by brushing a drop of gloss black on these sections here, gives you the look that the road wheels are full of their oil. This, of course, is done to both sides of the model. And it's one of those details that, if done to your M1 Abrams, will make it shine from the rest of the pack, as it's a detail feature that is commonly overlooked on most builds. And from the road wheels brings us to the sprocket. And here we have the sprocket re-railer. Now, there's nothing really much to mention. This is totally stock. I just wanted to point it out because it's one of the most iconic bits of detailing found on these early generation M1s, and it's actually one of my personal favorite attributes on this version of the Abrams. Okay, well, from there, this now brings us to the hull itself. Now, just like what is seen on a few of the other 1/72nd scale M1s that I've seen on the market, the old ESCI kit has its hull assembled in really 3 to 4 parts. The lower hull consists of 2 side sections, a bottom plate, and a rear section. On top of that, then we have the main upper body, which then gets affixed in the way you see it here. Now, because of this, you are going to have some seams to contend with, and this is true for just about all the other kits on the market that follow this type of an assembly. From what I remember, the fit was actually pretty good, but it's again something you want to take your time with. And you want to have the glues fully set and set in their appropriate locations before you carry on with the rest of the build. Moving back to the rear takes us to the rear hull detailing. Now, all of the details you see here are stock with the model. And the details are actually nicely done, considering, again, their small size and, again, the age of the model's tooling. We have here a tow hitch, as well as some lift points. The taillights are also found on this model and are very nicely rendered. They have their correct size and shape to them, and the only thing that was added to further enhance was just a small little swipe of gloss red paint. Now, also found on this model are the 2 little tow hooks that are found here on the back. Now, these are integrally molded to the bottom plate, and the only thing I did was, believe it or not, with a small Dremel bit on a pin vise, I drilled them out further, but this is something that is really hairy if tried, and it's really best only if you have the proper equipment. If not, leave the pieces as is. They're so small that really you could get away with just leaving them solid molded. Now on the front, this now brings us to the bow headlights and their brush guards, and again, everything you see here is totally stock. ESCI really does a nice job with their small tooling, and this kit is no exception. The pieces went on without any issues to mention, and just were painted just like they would be on any other kit. From there, this now brings us to the engine deck. Now again, all the details you see here are integrally molded to the ESCI kit. The ESCI M1 is actually a fairly simplistic kit once you get outside of the track and the running gear. Here you can see the intakes for the jet turbine engine. Note the model's detailing on this is also very nicely rendered. Specifically the little meshwork that we have here, it's nicely molded and is very fine, which is again a testament to the craftsmanship that went into making these older kits. Same is also true for the front, where you can see the driver's hatch. Note, to make the model enhance further, I went ahead and painted the bow driver's periscopes with a swipe of gloss black. Now, I believe on this early rendition of the M1, they didn't develop the ruby coverings which would cover these lenses on later iterations of the M1 to protect the crews from someone with a laser pointer shining a light in their eye. However, if I'm mistaken about that, please jot that down in the comment section listed below. For the model here, I just used, again, the gloss black. Here we have some more fuel filler caps here on the front. And this is true. I think it'll be easier just to take the turret off. And you can see the other one on the opposite side. Note the hull angles are all present on this kit, as well as the little box that we have here. And that basically wraps up the hull, which now brings us to the turret. Now the turret on the model here is comprised of a two-part assembly, which is basically what is standard on these kits. And just like with most models, there is a small seam that runs along these edges, which is easily addressed with some basic modeling skills. Now when it comes to the fit of these pieces, I don't recall any issues or any excessive hand fitting that was required, but it is something you want to test fit prior to committing with the adhesives. However, there is a small quirk with the ESCI M1 that is something that I did encounter on both times I've built this model, and that has to do with the elevation system for the main gun. Now, the kit does have a simple T mechanism that gets put in a little cradle, and the mantlet and the gun connect to it, which gives you a elevation feature. However, with the ESCI kit, there's a small quirk, I believe, with the length of the T section, where if you try to follow and build it out of the box, you're going to have a problem with the way the mantlet connects to the section, and it will inhibit the barrel mechanism from going up or down. This is something that is easily fixed, but it's something that needs to be hand fitted by the builder, so it's something to keep aware of if anyone is working on one of these kits. Once the tweak is made, however, the barrel is free to elevate and depress in a nice smooth manner that you see here. While on the mantlet and the barrel, this brings us to the bore evacuator. Now, one little quirk that the ESCI kit has is that there's a small sinkhole found in the bottom portion here of the bore evacuator. This little sinkhole, I believe, was also present on the other ESCI M1 that I built all those years ago. It's an easy fix, just a little drop of putty and the piece just blended away. For the coaxial machine gun, the little tube is present. Let's see if I get this in focus. And just like with most model kits, specifically 1/72nd scale, the unit is molded solid. With a very small drill bit on a pin vise, I was able to carefully, can't stress that enough, bore out this little detail here, which also helps the look of the model. But again, I have to stress, this should only be done if you have the appropriate tooling. Another substitute would be to utilize a very small tube of some sort, either aluminum or possibly plastic. If anything is the same diameter of the kit one that you see here, can be used in place of the kit part. But for this model here, I was able to just drill out the kit's offering. Now this brings us to the back. Here we have the wind sensor or albeit a very early rendition of the wind sensor found on the rear of the turret. And on this bottom portion here, just like with the bore evacuator, there was a small sinkhole that was easily addressed. But this is something that can be considered an eyesore and is something, again, to watch out for if anyone is working on one of these older kits. From there, it takes us to the Gypsy Rack. Now, one can definitely see how much the Gypsy Racks have greatly evolved from the M1 series from its original inception. Both the later renditions not only had these storage boxes extended where they came basically all the way up to the end here, but they also then continued to have a secondary rack and even a tertiary rack found here on the rear of the turret. With the old version of, or I should say with the original version of the M1, that's just not the case. And it has a much more sleeker and trimmed down design. These pieces here are all stock and are mounted as per the kit. This brings us to the top of the turret. This is, again, the early design of the blowout panels. This would be addressed and changed on the A1 version, which would replace these 3 doors with 2 giant doors, which would be found in this section here. Now, one thing about the turret I want to point out is that ESCI actually did a nice job with the rendering. The shape does look to be very spot on, and I believe they even have the correct length. From my understanding on the M1, the early versions had thinner armor found on the front, and because of that, the length of the turret was somewhat shorter compared to the later renditions like the A1 and the A2. And that is, I believe, found on this older kit. Also, another thing I want to point out is that you'll notice here that the angles found where these 2 plates meet is a nice sharp edge, but in the back, they're actually rounded. This is, again, as per the real vehicles. As it looks like on the real M1, this whole plate was actually bent and then welded in these locations here, which is a nice feature found, again, on this old kit. From there, brings us to the smoke grenade launchers. Now, these are the kit ones, and I gotta stress, are actually very, very frail and very tricky to remove not only off of the runner, but to deburr and mount to the vehicle. In fact, I almost lost one on a couple occasions, and I was actually very lucky to fit it to the model. Now, I do want to point out that the pieces are nicely shaped. However, they do have a quirk with the top sections having sinkholes on them. Again, a drop of red putty and a little bit of sandpaper was all that was required in order to polish them up to the way you see it here. From the launchers, now brings us to the main optic. It's missing some detailing, namely that of the little doors. On the M1 Abrams, there are these 2 doors that would fold up when the optic is not in use to protect the delicate equipment. These doors here were fabricated out of 2 pieces of thin styrene strip, which were cut to shape and just simply mounted in the open position. Now, another thing that I went ahead and did to improve the look of the model was that on the inside portion here, the periscope is actually completely open and hollow. One of the additions that I made to the model was that with a piece of clear plastic, I went ahead and affixed it to the inside of the tank, which then gives you the missing detailing of the optic itself. This greatly helps the accuracy of the model and bumps it up compared to leaving it stock. Now, from the optic, this now brings us to the vehicle's loader's hatch. Now, the loader's hatch is nicely rendered and detailed out of the box. However, just like with the main optic, they went ahead and, for whatever reason, molded the periscope in a hollow manner. Well, just like with the gunner scope, with a thin piece of clear plastic. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get into focus. No. Yeah, it's not going to come out on this camera, but there is a clear piece of plastic that is affixed to the inside portion here, and this gives you, again, the missing detailing, which would have been found on this kit. From there, this brings us to the vehicle's commander's cupola. Now, this model, being an early M1, features the original M1 cupola, which is vastly different from the one found on the A2 and the more modern variants of this vehicle. It still has the panoramic sight, and notice the panoramic periscopes are painted, but the real difference is with the mounting of the M2 HB50 caliber machine gun. The system found on the early M1 was very, I should say, iconic in that there's this large piston shock absorber here, which I believe is used to control the elevation of the weapon from the inside of the vehicle. All the components you see here are stock with the ESCI kit. Now, one thing I noticed on these ESCI M1s is that when it comes time for mounting of the machine gun, There's a small little piston device that I just mentioned, but on this kit here, the instructions are quite vague on exactly where it goes. So I best recommend for anyone who's working on one of these kits to dry fit this piece a couple times in order for you to get the feel, and once you got it, then commit with the glues. From there, it brings us to the M240, which is, again, decent. You know, the piece is considered dated compared to the type of detailing fidelity found on more modern kits, but for the model that we have here is perfectly suffice. It was just simply painted, weathered, and mounted to the model. Now, one other tip to point out is that when it comes to the machine gun ammo cans, this is true for both the M240 and the M2, you'll notice that the kits mold in the ammo tray with the ammo can. And this is a common feature found on many kits, not just this 1/72nd scale model. On all of my kits, I like to paint the ammo can or the ammo tray holder with a different color from the olive drab used on the ammo can, because this part here would be attached to the cradle or the vehicle, which would be a different shade of green compared to the dark olive drab typically found on US ammo cans. By doing this is another quick tip that greatly improves the look of your model compared to, again, leaving everything oversprayed with one shade of green. And moving from there brings us to this small little Jerrycan. This is, again, kit supplied, and just like with all of my Jerrycans, the mount is painted like the vehicle, and the strap is painted with a dark forest type green. This would be typical for the type of webbing found on military vehicles of this time frame. Here you can see the tow cables. These are, again, kit supplied, just painted, weathered, and affixed. And this takes us to the antenna. The antenna has a small little base molded in. This was drilled out very carefully with a pin vise, and then a piece of floor wire was added to complete the look. Now, in case anyone's wondering, I did not add the secondary antenna because, well, the piece is molded with the antenna cap in its place. So this model only has one antenna base. Not quite sure how accurate that is in the grand scheme of things, but for this model here, I guess it works just fine. Now, from the details brings us to the paint and the markings. Now, for the model's paint, I went with a Summer Verdant variant of the Merc camouflage scheme. As I've stated in a few of my other videos, the Merc camouflage scheme was adopted by the US military in the late 1970s throughout the 1980s, and it's basically a template paint-by-number system for adding camouflage to military vehicles. Now, one thing that was unique was that unlike the other vehicles which I've done Merc schemes on, in which there was a website that had all of the templates for applying this camouflage, for the Abrams, that wasn't one of the vehicles found on the list. So the camouflage as you see here was comprised of both sample photographs of real M1 Abrams of the period, as well as other various online resources I was able to find on exactly where the blotch layout goes. And with this vehicle being for what it is, with the time frame that these vehicles were adopted and used, is more than appropriate for this kit. Now, when it comes to markings, the vehicle did come with a set of decals, and as you can clearly see, I didn't use them. When it came time for the application of the decals, unfortunately, they did not age very well, and when the decals hit the water, they basically just crumbled and disintegrated. So rather than trying to roll the dice on it, I simply just omitted them from this build altogether. Now, I'm not sure if that's just the case with this ESCI kit that I have here, but possibly if anyone has one of these older ESCI kits, I would hazard against using the stock decals because they probably have a really good chance of not being very viable on your build when it comes time for the application. So you might want to look elsewhere for markings when working with not only these 1/72nd scale ESCIs, but also with the 172, or I should say the 1/35th scale kits as well. Now, when it comes for the other Reeboks versions of the ESCI kit, namely the ones from Italy, those vehicles are, again, done with more modern printing equipment, and those decals are a lot better in quality compared to the ones on these older kits from my experience. So it's something to watch out for. Now, I might as well compare and contrast the M1 with a more contemporary rendition of this vehicle. And here you can definitely see just how much this vehicle has evolved over the 30 plus years that it has been in US military service. And this vehicle here is the M1A2 Tusk II variant of the Abrams. And from my understanding is probably the most current version of the M1 Abrams, which is currently seeing service with the US military. Now this kit here is a 1/72nd scale model from Tiger Model. In fact, I've done a video on this build that can be found on the ECA channel, and I recommend checking out because you can see exactly how much plastic surgery was done to this build in order to get it up to the condition that you see it here. It's worth a little bit of a watch. In the end, I'm really happy in how this build turned out. The build itself went through in a very smooth and pretty much effortless manner, and the final outcome is one that I'm actually very happy with. The model's camouflage came out very well, and if anything, I've been getting a good knack for applying these murky camouflage schemes on these scale models. This one here, being the summer version, was one that I've wanted to add to my collection for a number of years now, and this one here is really the first time that I was able to do it with my new techniques that I've been playing around with for the last couple months. And personally for me, this model here is a little bit of a victory, as well as a little taste of redemption on account the last time I tackled one of these kits back in my early youth, the results were, let's say, less than presentable. So getting the model built up to these specs here really does feel good for me. Now that's one off of my revisit list, and there's probably a few more on there, but more information on that is better left, let's say, for another video for another day. Moving on to skill level and recommendation, because of the model's small size, in combination with some of the hand fitting that needs to be made to some of the parts, as well as some of the smaller details with their frailness to them, I really can't recommend this model to a beginner. I could speak also from personal experience. Building one of these kits as a beginner, it was not really an enjoyable build. This is also compounded with the fact that this model does have individual link and length tracks, which on a good day can be a little tricky to assemble. Basically, this kit would be best left for someone who's done a number of smaller scale 1/72nd scale builds on the market and has a good feeling on working on models of this scale, as well as completing a few other builds under their belt. Basically, this model would be best fit for someone who's an intermediate to an advanced range builder. A person with those type of skills can easily tackle one of these older ESCI kits. And that now takes us directly into recommendations. Obviously, this model is recommended for anybody who's an avid fan of the M1 Abrams. Being such an early rendition of this vehicle, this is a nice starting point in your Abrams family tree collection. And any of the other vehicles that came after this, like the M1A1, M1A2, all the way up to the Tusk, like I showcased before, would appreciate this kit here added to their collection. With this vehicle here being from the 1980s, this model would also fit into someone's collection who is an avid fan of Cold War era vehicles, as well as the usual repertoire of anyone who's a fan of American armor in general. And with being 172, if anyone is an avid fan of collecting and building Braille scale kits or working on small scale dioramas, this model here also ticks a lot of boxes. Not to mention anyone who is a fan of vintage model kit collecting and building as well. Like, well, yours truly. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale vintage ESCI M1 Abrams main battle tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, be it model showcase videos like this guy here, or the larger project update videos when they get posted. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been showcased on the ECA channel in the past. Finally, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. Thanks for watching.